Exactly 36 sultans, 400 years. With this video, you will both learn the things nobody has told you and drift into sleep. Tonight, we will see what it truly means to live as a sultan. This is a sleep documentary. Welcome to a journey through the marble corridors and golden chambers of the Topkapı Palace, where the most powerful men in the world lived lives that were simultaneously magnificent and suffocating. You might think being a sultan meant absolute freedom, unlimited power, and endless luxury. You would be only partially correct, because the Ottoman Sultanate was not just a position of power. It was a cage made of gold, a throne built on sand, and a crown that weighed heavier than any stone. If your eyes grow heavy as we walk through these halls, that is perfectly fine. If you drift into sleep imagining the silk cushions and fountain courtyards, you have found exactly what you need. But before you do, let me ask you this. Would you trade your freedom for absolute power? Would you accept never leaving a single building for your entire life if it meant ruling an empire? The sultans made that choice, or rather, that choice was made for them. The Ottoman Empire emerged in the late 13th century after Christ, founded by a man named Osman in the northwestern region of Anatolia. What began as a small frontier principality grew into one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. By the 15th century after Christ, the Ottomans controlled vast territories spanning 3 continents. They ruled over lands stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, from the shores of Algeria to the mountains of the Caucasus. At its peak, the empire governed approximately 13 million square kilometers and over 30 million people. This was not just a state. This was a civilization unto itself, a world within a world. And at the center of this world sat one man, the Sultan. The word Sultan comes from Arabic, meaning authority or power. But in the Ottoman context, the Sultan was far more than a political leader. He was the shadow of God on earth, the caliph of all Muslims, the protector of the holy cities, the emperor of 2 continents and 2 seas. These were not merely ceremonial titles. They represented genuine religious and political authority over millions of lives. The Sultan's word was law. His approval could elevate a peasant to vizier. His displeasure could end a life before sunset. This sounds like absolute power, and in many ways it was. But here is the paradox we will explore tonight. The most powerful man in the empire was also, in many ways, its most imprisoned. To understand what life was like for an Ottoman Sultan, we must first understand where they lived. The Topkapı Palace in Istanbul was not just a residence. It was a city within a city, covering nearly 70,000 square meters. Construction began in the mid-15th century after Christ under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. Over the centuries, each sultan added to it, expanded it, modified it according to his tastes and needs. The result was a sprawling complex of courtyards, gardens, pavilions, mosques, kitchens, treasuries, libraries, and residential quarters. At its peak, between 4,000 and 5,000 people lived and worked within these walls. Yet for all its grandeur, it was also a prison. Most sultans, especially after the 17th century after Christ, rarely if ever left these grounds. Some spent their entire adult lives within these walls, seeing the outside world only through latticed windows or from distant terraces. Now, before we step inside, let me ask you something that we will answer as our journey continues. How did someone become a sultan? You might think it passed from father to eldest son, as in European monarchies. You would be wrong. The Ottoman succession system was unlike anything else in the world, and understanding it is crucial to understanding everything else about the sultan's life. We will return to this question soon. But first, let us walk through the Imperial Gate, the first of 3 gates that separated the sultan from the common world. The first courtyard was semi-public, accessible to anyone with business at the palace. Here you would find the imperial mint, bakeries, workshops and storage facilities. Government officials, foreign ambassadors, merchants with contracts all passed through here. But this was merely the outer shell. To proceed further, you needed permission. The Gate of Salutation, adorned with towers and guarded by palace sentries, led to the second courtyard. This was where the machinery of government operated. The divan, the imperial council, met here in a chamber beneath a distinctive tower. The Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister, presided over meetings of the other viziers, military commanders, and religious authorities. They discussed matters of state, reviewed petitions, settled disputes, planned military campaigns, and managed the empire's vast bureaucracy. And here is something remarkable. The Sultan often listened to these meetings without being seen. A latticed window above the council chamber connected to the Sultan's private quarters. From there, hidden behind the screen, he could observe the discussions without revealing his presence. This way, he could gauge the honesty of his ministers, detect conspiracies, and make decisions based on unguarded conversations. The councillors knew the Sultan might be listening, but they never knew for certain. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance, a feeling that the Sultan's eyes and ears were everywhere even when he himself was nowhere to be seen. The second courtyard also housed the palace kitchens, massive structures that prepared thousands of meals daily. These were not ordinary kitchens. They employed over 800 staff members, including chefs, bakers, confectioners, and specialists in various cuisines. The Sultan's own meals were prepared in separate sections, with elaborate precautions against poisoning that we will explore in detail later. The variety of dishes was extraordinary. Ottoman palace cuisine represented a fusion of traditions from across the empire: Turkish, Arab, Persian, Greek, Armenian, and more. A single imperial feast might include over 100 different dishes, from delicate pastries soaked in honey to whole roasted lamb stuffed with rice and nuts, from yogurt soups to sherbet drinks cooled with snow brought down from mountain peaks. But the Sultan rarely ate in public. His meals were usually served in his private chambers, often alone or with only the most intimate companions. This isolation during meals was not merely preference, it was protection. Every dish that reached the Sultan's table had been tasted multiple times by different servants, each one risking their own life to ensure the Sultan's safety. The fear of poisoning was constant and justified. Palace histories record numerous attempts, some successful, to eliminate sultans through poisoned food, drink, or even perfume. Trust was a luxury no sultan could truly afford, not even at his own dinner table. Moving deeper into the palace, we reach the Gate of Felicity. Beyond this point was the third courtyard, the truly private domain of the Sultan. Only the highest-ranking officials and most trusted servants could enter here. This courtyard contained the audience chamber, where the Sultan granted formal audiences while seated on a jewel-encrusted throne. Foreign ambassadors who reached this point described the experience with a mixture of awe and terror. They would be led through the courtyards in absolute silence, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Then, suddenly, they would be brought before the throne. The Sultan, dressed in robes of silk and brocade, wearing a turban adorned with jewels and plumes, would sit motionless and silent. The chief white eunuch would stand beside him. The visitor would bow deeply, present their credentials or gifts, and deliver their message. Often the Sultan would not speak at all. He might simply nod or gesture to a vizier to respond. This silence was intentional. It created mystique, reinforced the Sultan's distance from ordinary mortals, and prevented any casual diplomatic missteps. Words spoken by the Sultan carried absolute weight, so they were dispensed carefully and sparingly. But here is something that might surprise you. Despite all this ceremony, despite the elaborate protocols and the aura of divine authority, many sultans were surprisingly young when they took the throne. Some were still children. Sultan Mehmed IV was only 7 years old when he became sultan in the mid-17th century after Christ. Imagine being 7 years old and suddenly everyone around you bows to the ground in your presence. Imagine being told you are the shadow of God on earth before you have learned to read properly. Imagine having ministers 3 or 4 times your age seeking your approval for decisions that will affect millions of lives. This was the reality for several Ottoman sultans, and it raises an obvious question. Who actually ruled when the Sultan was a child? The answer reveals one of the most fascinating aspects of Ottoman palace life, but we will explore that mystery shortly. First, we need to understand the harem, because no discussion of the Sultan's life can be complete without understanding this most misunderstood institution. The harem occupied the fourth courtyard and parts of the third, a separate complex connected to the Sultan's private quarters, but maintaining its own distinct organisation. The word harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred. This was the domestic heart of the palace, the residential quarters of the Sultan's family. Here lived the Sultan's mother, his wives and concubines, his sisters and daughters, and hundreds of female servants and enslaved women. The entire complex was guarded and managed by black eunuchs, men who had been taken from Africa as children, subjected to complete removal of their reproductive organs, and trained for palace service. The chief black eunuch was one of the most powerful figures in the entire empire, controlling access to the Sultan's private life and managing vast resources. Now, let us pause here and address something that needs clarification, because popular imagination has painted a wildly inaccurate picture of the Ottoman harem. It was not a pleasure palace where the Sultan spent his days in mindless indulgence. It was not filled with hundreds of willing partners eagerly competing for royal attention. The reality was far more complex, more structured, and in many ways more troubling than the fantasy. The harem was a hierarchical institution with strict rules, elaborate etiquette, and intense political dynamics. Most of the women who lived there never even met the Sultan, let alone formed any intimate relationship with him. They were servants, attendants, teachers, and administrators within a separate female-managed household that happened to exist within the larger palace structure. At the top of the harem hierarchy stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was arguably the most powerful woman in the entire empire, and depending on the Sultan's age and temperament, sometimes the most powerful person in the empire outright. The Valide Sultan controlled the harem's administration, managed its considerable budget, and wielded enormous influence over her son's decisions. When a sultan was young or inexperienced, his mother often became the de facto ruler, guiding policy, appointing officials, and even directing military campaigns. The most famous example was Ottoman Sultan, who effectively ruled the empire during the early to mid-17th century after Christ through her son Murad IV, and later through her grandson Mehmed IV. Her influence became so great that she was eventually killed in a power struggle with another ambitious woman, the Valide Sultan Turhan, mother of Mehmed IV. Yes, the Ottoman harem witnessed internal conflicts that sometimes turned deadly, struggles for power that would determine the fate of the empire itself. Below the Valide Sultan came the official wives of the Sultan, if he had legally married. Ottoman practice regarding marriage evolved over time. Early sultans often married princesses from neighbouring states as part of diplomatic alliances. Later sultans typically did not legally marry at all, instead maintaining relationships with enslaved concubines. This might seem strange, but it served a political purpose. Legal wives would bring their own families, their own political connections, their own competing interests into the palace. Concubines, taken as slaves and converted to Islam, had no external family support, no competing loyalties. They were completely dependent on the Sultan and the palace system. This made them easier to control and less likely to become centres of rival power networks. Next in hierarchy came the concubines who had borne the Sultan's children. Giving birth to a prince or princess elevated a woman's status considerably. She received her own apartments, her own servants, and a regular income. Most importantly, she gained a stake in the succession struggle that would inevitably come when the Sultan passed away. Because here is where we return to that earlier question. How did the Ottoman succession actually work? The answer is both fascinating and horrifying, and it shaped every single day of a sultan's life from birth to death. Unlike European monarchies with clear rules of primogeniture, the Ottoman system followed a simple but brutal principle. The fittest member of the dynasty should rule. In practice, this meant that when a sultan passed away, his sons would compete for the throne. The winner was whoever could seize power first, eliminate his rivals, and secure the loyalty of the military and the bureaucracy. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries after Christ, this competition was formalized through an unwritten law known as fratricide. When a new sultan took the throne, he would immediately order the execution of all his brothers, all of them. Sometimes there were 2 or 3, sometimes there were 19. They would be strangled with a silk cord, this being considered a more honourable method than beheading, and their bodies would be buried with ceremony. The justification for this horror was practical. Better to sacrifice a few princes than to plunge the empire into civil war. A disputed succession could tear the state apart, lead to rebellions, invite foreign invasion, and cause the suffering of millions. Better one terrible day than years of chaos. Or so the reasoning went. Now imagine what this meant for a young prince growing up in the palace. From childhood, you knew that your brothers were potential rivals to the death. You could not trust them. You could not confide in them. You could not even safely love them. Because one day, either you would have to order their execution or they would order yours. Imagine what this did to family relationships, to the psychology of these young men, to the atmosphere within the palace. The harem, which should have been a space of family warmth, became instead an arena of constant suspicion and manoeuvring. Mothers plotted to advance their own sons, concubines formed factions, eunuchs picked sides. Everyone understood that succession day was coming, and when it arrived there would be winners and losers, and the losers would not survive. This system eventually changed. By the early 17th century after Christ, the practice of automatic fratricide was replaced with a new custom called the kayfays, which means the cage. Instead of executing princes, they would be confined to special apartments within the palace. These were comfortable enough, with furnishings and servants, but they were prisons nonetheless. Princes lived in the cage from childhood, sometimes for decades, completely isolated from the outside world. They had no education in governance, no military training, no experience with anything beyond their gilded rooms. When one of these princes eventually became sultan, often because all other candidates had already passed away, he would suddenly be thrust into absolute power without any preparation. Some adapted. Others descended into madness or incompetence. One sultan, Ibrahim I in the mid-17th century after Christ, had spent 22 years in the cage before becoming sultan at age 24. His mental state never fully recovered, and his reign was marked by erratic behaviour that eventually led to his deposition and execution. So we see that even succession to the throne, which should have been a moment of triumph, was shadowed by trauma and tragedy. No Ottoman Sultan could look back on his path to power without seeing the graves of his brothers or the wasted years of his own confinement. This was the price of absolute power, absolute isolation, absolute suspicion, and absolute loss. But let us return to the daily life of a sultan who has survived succession, eliminated or confined his rivals, and now rules. What did his typical day actually look like? The answer varied considerably depending on the sultan's personality, the historical period, and whether the empire was at war or peace. But certain patterns remained consistent across the centuries. The sultan's day began before dawn with the call to prayer from the palace mosque. Islamic law requires 5 daily prayers, and the sultan, as caliph and leader of the Muslim community, was expected to be scrupulous in his religious observances. Most sultans performed their dawn prayers in their private chambers, led by a personal imam. This was a moment of solitude, or as close to solitude as a sultan ever experienced. Even here, servants would be present just outside the chamber, ready to attend to any need. After prayers came a light breakfast, typically consisting of bread, cheese, honey, olives, and tea or sherbet. Again, every item had been carefully tasted by multiple servants beforehand. While eating, the sultan might review reports that had been prepared overnight by his secretaries. These reports covered everything from military movements on distant frontiers to grain prices in provincial markets, from petitions by ordinary subjects to diplomatic correspondence from foreign courts. The Ottoman bureaucracy was remarkably efficient at collecting and organising information. Everything was written down, filed, and made available to the sultan if he chose to examine it. Some sultans were voracious readers of these reports, involving themselves in minute details of administration. Others delegated most reading to their viziers and focused only on major decisions. The empire was large enough that a single person could not possibly manage every detail, regardless of how diligent he might be. This is why the Grand Vizier position became so crucial. The Grand Vizier was essentially the Prime Minister, the operational head of government who handled daily administration, while the Sultan provided overall direction and made final decisions on major policies. After breakfast, the Sultan might grant private audiences. These were different from the formal receptions in the audience chamber. These were working meetings with the Grand Vizier, the chief white eunuch, military commanders, religious scholars, or other high officials. Discussion would cover current problems, propose solutions, and requests for the Sultan's approval or guidance. A skilled Sultan would listen carefully, ask probing questions, and reserve judgment until he'd heard all sides of an issue. An unskilled Sultan might rubber stamp whatever his advisors suggested, effectively ceding real power while maintaining the appearance of rule. Some sultans were true statesmen, wrestling with complex problems and making difficult choices. Others were figureheads, manipulated by more capable or more ambitious ministers. The system could function either way, which speaks to both the strength and the weakness of Ottoman governance. Strong institutions could carry a weak sultan, but they could also limit a strong sultan who wanted to implement reforms against bureaucratic resistance. Midday brought another prayer session, followed by the main meal of the day. This was usually more elaborate than breakfast, with multiple courses served in succession. The sultan might dine alone, or he might invite favoured companions, poets, musicians, religious scholars, or trusted advisors. These meals were opportunities for less formal conversation, for building relationships, for displaying favour. An invitation to dine with the sultan was a tremendous honour and a sign of trust, or at least of current approval, which in the palace might change at any moment. After the meal came rest. The afternoon hours were often spent in the sultan's private chambers or in one of the palace pavilions. These pavilions were architectural gems scattered throughout the palace grounds, small buildings designed for relaxation and contemplation. The Baghdad Pavilion, built in the 17th century after Christ, featured walls covered in intricate ceramic tiles depicting flowers and geometric patterns. The Revan Pavilion, from the same period, offered views over the palace gardens and the Golden Horn. In these spaces, the Sultan could read, listen to music, compose poetry, or simply sit in silence. Many sultans were accomplished poets, writing verses in Ottoman Turkish, Persian, or Arabic. Poetry was considered an essential accomplishment for a refined person, and the Sultan was expected to be the most refined person in the empire. Some sultans left behind substantial collections of poetry, works that are still studied today for their literary merit. Others composed calligraphy, another highly respected art form. The Sultan's handwriting would appear on official documents, giving them legal force, so beautiful penmanship was both an artistic achievement and a practical skill. The afternoon hours were also when the Sultan might visit the harem. Despite the popular imagination, these visits were often quite domestic in nature. The Sultan might spend time with his children, watching them play or overseeing their education. Ottoman princes and princesses received extensive tutoring in languages, literature, music, religion, and for the princes, military skills and statecraft. The Sultan would take interest in their progress, questioning their tutors and sometimes instructing them personally. He might visit with his mother, the Valide Sultan, discussing palace affairs or seeking her counsel. The relationship between a sultan and his mother was often the closest and most trusting relationship he would ever have. She was the one person whose loyalty was absolutely certain, whose advice was untainted by personal ambition beyond her son's success and her family's security. Some sultans relied heavily on their mothers throughout their reigns. Others maintained more distance, especially if conflicts arose between the Valide Sultan and the sultan's own wives or favourite concubines. The evening prayer came as the sun set, followed by a lighter meal. Then might come entertainment. The palace maintained a large staff of musicians, dancers, and storytellers. Performances might be held in the sultan's chambers or in specially designated entertainment halls. This was not crude or bawdy entertainment. Ottoman palace culture valued sophistication and refinement. Music was complex and formal, following classical Middle Eastern traditions with influences from Persian and Byzantine sources. Dance was elegant and symbolic, performed by trained specialists. Stories might be recited from classical literature, or professional storytellers might improvise tales based on traditional themes, adapting them to subtly flatter the Sultan or comment on current events. Humour existed, but it was clever wordplay and witty observation rather than vulgarity. The Sultan was surrounded by culture and learning, by beauty carefully curated and presented for his enjoyment. Yet even this came with a certain sadness. The Sultan could never be sure whether people laughed at his jokes because they were genuinely funny or because he was the Sultan. He could never know if a poem pleased him because it was beautiful or because he had been trained since childhood to recognise and appreciate beauty according to specific aesthetic rules. Authenticity was always in question, genuine connection always just out of reach. The night prayer, the fifth and final prayer of the day, came several hours after sunset. After this, the Sultan would retire to his bedchamber, but even sleep was surrounded by precautions and protocol. The Sultan's bed was located in a special chamber within his private apartments. Before he entered, servants would inspect the room thoroughly, checking for hidden assassins or dangerous objects. The bedding would be examined. Even the pillows would be shaken out. Once the Sultan entered and the door was closed, guards would be posted immediately outside throughout the night. Some sources suggest that the Sultan's exact sleeping location within his chambers was kept secret, with multiple beds prepared and the Sultan randomly choosing one each night. This way, even if an assassin somehow penetrated the outer defences, they would not know exactly where to strike. Sleep itself could never be completely unguarded or unworried for a man who wore the crown. This daily routine, this pattern of prayers, meals, work and rest, might seem pleasant enough, even luxurious compared to the lives of ordinary people, and in material terms it certainly was. The Sultan wanted for nothing in terms of physical comfort, but consider what was missing. The Sultan could not simply decide to go for a walk outside the palace. He could not visit a marketplace and browse the goods. He could not have a conversation with a stranger who did not know who he was. He could not make a friend based on mutual interest rather than mutual advantage. He could not trust that people loved him for himself rather than for his position. He lived in a magnificent cage, served by thousands of people, yet profoundly alone. This isolation was not accidental. It was built into the system, considered necessary for security and for maintaining the mystique of absolute power, but it exacted a psychological cost that few outsiders ever understood. Now, we have been discussing the Sultan's daily life within the palace, but what about when he left? Did sultans ever venture beyond those walls? The answer is yes, but these departures were elaborate productions rather than casual outings. When the Sultan travelled, it was always for specific purposes: military campaigns, pilgrimages to holy sites, hunting expeditions, or visits to other imperial palaces. Each of these involved massive logistical preparation and occurred with great ceremony. Military campaigns were the most significant reason for a sultan to leave the palace. In the early centuries of the empire, sultans personally led their armies into battle. Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in the mid-15th century after Christ by personally directing the siege. Suleiman I, often called Suleiman the Magnificent, spent much of his long reign in the 16th century after Christ on military campaigns, pushing the empire's borders to their greatest extent. These warrior sultans saw themselves as ghazis, warriors for the faith, continuing the tradition of early Islamic expansion. They slept in campaign tents, rode at the head of their armies, and shared at least some of the hardships of military life. This gave them credibility with their soldiers, allowed them to directly oversee strategy and tactics, and demonstrated that the Sultan was not merely a remote figurehead, but an active leader willing to risk himself for the empire's glory. However, military campaigns were also incredibly dangerous, not just from enemy action, but from disease, accidents, and the strain of travel. Several sultans passed away while on campaign, far from the comforts and security of the palace. And when a sultan was away for months or years, governing from a campaign tent hundreds or thousands of kilometers from Istanbul, problems could arise back at the capital. Rivals might plot, ministers might scheme, and the absence of the sultan's direct oversight could lead to corruption or mismanagement. This tension between the military necessity of the sultan's presence in the field and the administrative necessity of his presence in the capital became more acute over time. By the 17th century after Christ, sultans rarely led campaigns personally. Instead, they would appoint a grand vizier or other commander to lead the armies, while the sultan remained in Istanbul. This reduced personal risk, but also reduced the sultan's direct military prestige, and allowed the grand vizier to accumulate dangerous amounts of independent power and influence. Hunting expeditions were another reason for the sultan to leave the palace, though these rarely went far from Istanbul. The Ottoman sultans maintained hunting grounds in the forests outside the city, stocked with game including deer, boar, and sometimes more exotic animals. Hunting served multiple purposes. It was recreation and exercise, important for a man who spent most of his time in sedentary administrative work. It was also training for war, maintaining the sultan's skills with weapons and his physical fitness, and it was an opportunity for the sultan to demonstrate traditional masculine virtues: courage, skill, and dominance over nature. These hunts were carefully choreographed affairs involving hundreds of participants, including beaters to drive the game, trackers to follow trails, and guards to ensure the sultan's safety. The actual danger to the sultan was minimal, though occasionally accidents did occur. The real purpose was not the practical acquisition of food, as the palace kitchens were already well supplied, but rather the symbolic performance of the hunt, showing that the sultan embodied the warrior virtues that the Ottoman state valued, and that had built the empire in the first place. Religious pilgrimages were less common, but carried great spiritual and political significance. The Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca was required of all Muslims who were physically and financially able to make the journey. However, Ottoman sultans rarely performed the Hajj themselves. The journey was long, dangerous, and would require the sultan to be absent from the capital for many months. Instead, sultans would sponsor elaborate pilgrimage caravans, providing security and supplies for thousands of pilgrims travelling from Ottoman territories to the holy cities. The sultan would send rich gifts to Mecca and Medina, demonstrating his piety and his role as protector of the holy places. This allowed him to fulfill his religious obligations by proxy, while maintaining security and control at home. Some sultans did make shorter pilgrimages to important mosques and shrines within their own territories, using these journeys to display their devotion, connect with their subjects, and reinforce the religious legitimacy of their rule. These trips were always public spectacles, with the sultan processing through the streets accompanied by his guards, his officials, and often his entire court, while crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of their sovereign. So even when the sultan left the palace, he did not truly escape it. He travelled within a mobile version of the palace, surrounded by the same protocols, the same hierarchies, the same security measures. True freedom of movement, the ability to go where he wished without elaborate preparation or massive entourages, was simply not possible for a sultan. The cage was portable, but it was still a cage. Let us turn now to a question that might seem mundane but reveals much about the sultan's life. What did he wear? Ottoman sultans were among the most magnificently dressed individuals in the world, and their clothing served purposes far beyond mere covering or comfort. Every garment, every accessory, every detail of the sultan's appearance was laden with symbolism, conveyed messages about power and legitimacy, and reinforced the distance between the sultan and ordinary mortals. The most distinctive element of the sultan's attire was his turban. This was not the simple, wrapped cloth worn by common people. The sultan's turban was an elaborate construction, involving multiple layers of fabric, often silk or fine cotton, wrapped around a specially shaped cap. The size and style of the turban evolved over the centuries, with some periods favouring huge turbans that could be half a metre tall, while other periods preferred more moderate proportions. The turban would often be adorned with jewels, gold ornaments and plumes from rare birds. A large jewel, sometimes an emerald or ruby of extraordinary value, might be pinned at the front, catching the light and drawing the eye. The turban represented authority and religious propriety, as covering the head was required for Muslim men, and the sultan's turban was the most splendid head covering in the empire. Beneath the turban, the sultan wore layers of robes called kaftans. These were long, flowing garments that fell from the shoulders to the ankles, often made of silk brocade woven with gold or silver thread in intricate patterns. The colours and patterns had symbolic meanings. Deep red signified power and martial prowess. Rich blues suggested wisdom and nobility. Green, the colour associated with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, indicated religious authority. Gold thread represented wealth and imperial majesty. A single kaftan might require months of work by skilled weavers and embroiderers, and the sultan owned hundreds of them, changing his outfit multiple times per day for different occasions and audiences. The kaftans were cut generously, allowing free movement while creating an impressive silhouette that enhanced the sultan's physical presence. The outermost layer might be a fur-lined robe, even in summer, as thick furs demonstrated wealth and status. Sable, ermine and lynx were particularly prized. These furs came from the empire's northern territories or from trade with Russia, and their rarity and cost made them suitable only for the highest ranks of society. When the sultan granted an audience, the sight of him seated on his throne, robed in jewel-encrusted silk overlaid with precious furs, topped with a gem-studded turban, created an overwhelming impression of wealth, power, and otherworldly magnificence. This was intentional. The sultan's appearance was designed to inspire awe, to reinforce the vast distance between him and his subjects, and to make clear that he was no ordinary man but rather a being set apart by divine favour and imperial destiny. The sultan also wore a ceremonial sword, another symbol of authority and military power. This was not a practical weapon for actual combat, but rather an ornamental piece with a jewelled hilt and an elaborately decorated scabbard. The sword represented the sultan's role as commander of the faithful, defender of Islam, and leader of the Ottoman military. It connected him to the tradition of warrior sultans who had built the empire through conquest, even if the current sultan had never personally fought in battle. On ceremonial occasions, the sword would be girded on the sultan by the Grand Vizier or another high official in a formal ritual that symbolized the acceptance of military responsibility and the commitment to protect the empire. Jewelry completed the ensemble. The sultan might wear rings set with precious stones, each stone believed to have specific properties or meanings. Emeralds were thought to protect against poison and aid digestion. Rubies represented courage and vitality. Diamonds symbolized invincibility. Whether these beliefs had any basis in reality is beside the point. The important thing was that people believed them, and the sultan's display of such gems reinforced the idea that he enjoyed supernatural protection and favour. Pearls might be sewn into the hems of robes or used to create elaborate decorative patterns. These pearls came from the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, brought to Istanbul by merchants who paid substantial fees for the privilege of supplying the imperial household. Even the sultan's shoes were objects of luxury and symbolism. Made of fine leather, often in bright colours, they would be embroidered with gold thread and sometimes set with small jewels. The soles might be slightly elevated, raising the sultan above the level of those around him, literally making him taller and more imposing. When the sultan walked, his garments would rustle with the sound of silk, and the subtle tinkling of jewelled ornaments announcing his approach even before he came into view. This audio dimension of royal presence was carefully considered. The Sultan should not move silently like a servant, but should command attention through sound as well as sight. Now you might be growing tired. Your eyes might be heavy. That is perfectly natural. If you drift away now, imagining silk robes and jeweled turbans, you will carry these images into your dreams. But if you're still with me, let me ask you this. Why did all this magnificence matter? Why spend fortunes on clothing that would be worn once or twice and then stored away? The answer lies in understanding how power works in a pre-modern society. In a world without mass media, without photographs or videos, without any way to project an image to millions of people simultaneously, the Sultan's appearance at public ceremonies and audiences was one of the few ways most people would ever form an impression of their ruler. Those who saw him in person would describe the experience to others. The stories would spread, grow in the telling, and create an image of the Sultan as a being of supernatural splendor. This image helped maintain social order, discouraged rebellion, and reinforced the legitimacy of Ottoman rule. The expensive clothing was not frivolous. It was a form of political communication, a way of making abstract concepts like sovereignty and divine right visible and tangible. The Sultan wore the empire's wealth and power on his body, turning himself into a living symbol of everything the Ottoman state represented. This brings us to another aspect of the Sultan's life that needs exploration: his education and intellectual development. What kind of knowledge did a Sultan possess? What had he been taught? And how did this education shape his approach to rule? The answer varied considerably depending on the historical period and the individual Sultan, but certain patterns emerge. In the earlier centuries of the empire, princes received extensive education in preparation for potential rule. They were taught to read and write in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic and Persian, the three languages of Islamic high culture. Ottoman Turkish was the administrative language of the state, used for official documents and government correspondence. Arabic was the language of the Quran and Islamic religious scholarship, essential for any Muslim ruler. Persian was the language of poetry and refined culture, considered the mark of an educated person. A well-educated prince could compose verses in all three languages, switch between them fluently depending on the context, and appreciate the subtle distinctions in meaning and style that each language offered. This multilingual education gave sultans access to vast libraries of religious texts, historical chronicles, philosophical treatises, and literary works. A sultan who chose to be a scholar had an empire's worth of knowledge at his fingertips, with court librarians and scholars available to locate any text or explain any concept he wished to explore. Religious education was paramount. The sultan was the caliph, the leader of the Muslim community, and he needed to understand Islamic law, theology, and tradition. Princes studied the Quran, memorizing large portions and learning the principles of Quranic interpretation. They studied hadith, the collected sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which provided guidance on legal and ethical questions. They learned about the development of Islamic jurisprudence, the different schools of legal thought, and how Islamic law should be applied in various situations. This religious education was not merely theoretical. It had practical implications for governance, as the Sultan was expected to uphold Islamic law and ensure that justice was administered according to religious principles throughout his realm. A sultan ignorant of Islamic tradition would lose legitimacy and respect among religious scholars and the pious population. Military training was also essential, especially in the empire's earlier centuries. Princes learned to ride horses, handle weapons including swords, bows, and later firearms, and understand military tactics and strategy. They might observe actual military exercises or even participate in campaigns under the supervision of experienced commanders. The goal was to produce sultans who could credibly lead armies, make sound strategic decisions, and earn the respect of the military establishment. A sultan who appeared weak or incompetent in military matters risked losing the loyalty of the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that formed the backbone of the Ottoman military and that had significant political influence within the capital. The Janissaries had deposed and even executed sultans they deemed unfit, so maintaining their approval was a matter of survival as much as effective governance. Beyond these core subjects, princes might study mathematics, astronomy, music, calligraphy, and other arts and sciences depending on their interests and abilities. Some sultans became accomplished in these fields. Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople, was known for his intellectual curiosity and his patronage of scholars, artists, and poets from across the Islamic world and even from Christian Europe. He could converse knowledgeably on philosophy, commission translations of classical Greek and Latin works, and invited Italian artists to his court. Suleiman I was himself a skilled poet and goldsmith, creating delicate jewellery and composing verses that balance personal emotion with classical forms. These accomplished sultans demonstrated that the role was not merely about wielding power, but about embodying the highest cultural and intellectual achievements of their civilization. However, this ideal of the well-educated, culturally refined sultan became harder to maintain as the succession system changed. When princes began to be confined in the cage, their education suffered dramatically. Locked in their apartments with limited contact with the outside world, they could not receive the broad, practical education that earlier princes had enjoyed. Their teachers were restricted, their access to books limited, their opportunities for physical and military training almost non-existent. They might learn to read and write, study some religious texts, and develop skills in calligraphy or poetry to pass the long years of confinement, but they could not learn statecraft by observing government in action, could not develop military skills through training and experience, and could not form the networks of relationships and the understanding of human nature that effective rule required. When such a prince emerged from the cage to become sultan, he often lacked the knowledge and skills his position demanded. This contributed to the gradual shift of real power away from the sultan toward the grand vizier and other officials who possessed the experience and competence the sultan lacked. So we see that the sultan's education could range from comprehensive and excellent to tragically inadequate depending on the circumstances of his upbringing. When we look at it, we can see that the sultan's education, along with the efforts invested from beginning to end, could vary comprehensively from childhood to adulthood. However, even though one could have received an excellent education, the sultan could face fundamental problems. Could all the acquired knowledge prepare a person for these responsibilities? By learning all the knowledge about justice, how could it teach a young man the fine line between life and death? Could he have made irreversible mistakes? We should also consider the sultan's relationship with religion, as this shaped both his daily life and his long-term decisions. The Ottoman Sultan held the title of Caliph, claiming to be the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the leader of all Muslims. This was not merely a ceremonial title. It carried real religious authority and responsibilities that influenced every aspect of governance and personal conduct. As Caliph, the Sultan was expected to be a model of Islamic piety and virtue. He should pray 5 times daily, fast during Ramadan, give charity to the poor, and uphold Islamic law in his personal life and his public policies. The Sultan's behaviour was scrutinised by religious scholars, the ulama, who served as a check on his power. If the Sultan violated Islamic principles too blatantly, if he behaved in ways that contradicted religious law or tradition, the ulema could issue legal opinions questioning his legitimacy. In extreme cases, they could even support his deposition. This happened several times in Ottoman history when a sultan's behaviour became intolerable to religious authorities. The ulema would declare the sultan unfit to rule, provide religious justification for removing him, and support the elevation of a replacement. So despite his theoretical absolute power, the sultan was not entirely free to do as he pleased. He operated within a framework of religious law and tradition that constrained his actions and held him accountable, at least in theory, to principles higher than his own will. The sultan's role as protector of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina was particularly important. Control over these sites gave the Ottomans enormous prestige in the Muslim world. The sultan ensured that pilgrims could safely travel to perform the Hajj, maintained the infrastructure of the holy cities, and sent lavish gifts to beautify the mosques and support the religious scholars who lived there. Every year, an elaborate ceremony would mark the departure of the Hajj caravan from Istanbul. The sultan or his representative would present the mamal, a decorated palanquin that symbolized Ottoman sovereignty over the holy cities, and the kiswa, the ornate cloth covering for the Kaaba in Mecca that the Ottomans provided annually. These ceremonies reinforced the sultan's religious role and connected him to the broader Islamic world beyond his empire's borders. At the same time, the sultan's court included elements that strict interpretations of Islamic law might question. The consumption of wine, officially prohibited in Islam, was tolerated in palace circles, particularly during the later centuries of the empire. Music and dancing, which some religious scholars considered frivolous or potentially sinful distractions from proper devotion, were regular features of palace entertainment. The presence of the harem, with its implications of concubinage and the keeping of enslaved women, could be justified under Islamic law, but pushed the boundaries of what the more austere religious scholars considered appropriate. The sultan had to navigate between the demands of religious propriety and the established traditions of palace life between his role as caliph and religious exemplar and his role as an absolute monarch accustomed to having his desires fulfilled. Different sultans struck this balance differently. Some were genuinely pious and tried to align their personal conduct with strict religious standards. Others were more worldly, observing the outward forms of religion while indulging privately in pleasures that religious law discouraged. As long as a sultan maintained public propriety, supported religious institutions, and enforced Islamic law in the courts and administration, the ulema generally tolerated a degree of private flexibility. It was understood that the sultan was human, that he faced unique temptations and pressures, and that complete perfection was not realistic. What mattered was maintaining the system, preserving the empire, and upholding Islam's position as the state religion. The sultan also served as a patron of religious architecture, commissioning the construction of mosques, schools, hospitals, and other charitable institutions. These buildings served practical purposes, providing places for worship, education, and social services, but they also served as permanent monuments to the sultan's piety and generosity, visible statements of his commitment to Islamic values that would endure long after he passed away. The great imperial mosques of Istanbul, with their soaring domes and slender minarets, were deliberately designed to rival and surpass the Christian churches of Byzantine Constantinople. They demonstrated that Islamic architecture could achieve heights of beauty and technical sophistication equal to anything the Christian world had produced. When a sultan commissioned such a mosque, he was not just building a place to pray, he was making a statement about the power, wealth, and cultural achievement of Islamic civilization under Ottoman leadership. He was claiming a place in history alongside the great Muslim rulers of the past who had similarly left behind magnificent architectural legacies. Now let me ask you something we will return to shortly. What happened when a sultan became seriously ill or grew old and weak? In a system where power was absolute and personal, where the sultan's word was law and his signature authorized all major decisions, what occurred when the sultan could no longer effectively rule? This question brings us to some of the darkest moments in Ottoman palace life, but before we explore those shadows, let us consider the sultan's personal relationships, the human connections that provided whatever warmth and genuine affection might exist in his otherwise isolated life. Despite the constraints and the political calculations that surrounded every interaction, sultans were still human beings with emotional needs. They formed attachments, developed friendships, and sought companionship, even if these relationships were always complicated by the power imbalance that infected everything in the palace. The sultan's closest emotional bond was often with his mother, as we have discussed, but he might also develop genuine affection for certain concubines, particular children, or trusted advisors who had served him loyally for years. These relationships were the sultan's refuge, the spaces where he could hope to be valued for himself rather than merely for his position. Some sultans formed lasting attachments to specific concubines, maintaining relationships that resembled marriages even if they were not legally formalized as such. Suleiman I famously became devoted to a concubine known to history as Ottoman Sultan, called Roxolana in European sources. Their relationship was remarkable for its depth and duration. Hurrem bore Suleiman multiple children and wielded significant political influence, corresponding with foreign rulers and involving herself in imperial policy. Eventually, Suleiman broke with Ottoman tradition and legally married her, elevating her to a status unprecedented for a former concubine. Their relationship appears to have included genuine emotional attachment alongside political partnership. Letters between them survive, showing warmth and even playfulness, a glimpse of the private person behind the imperial mask. Yet even this relationship was not entirely free from the palace's political dynamics. Hurrem worked tirelessly to advance her son's positions and eliminate potential rivals, contributing to succession struggles that would tear the empire apart after Suleiman's passing. Love and politics were inseparable in the palace. Even the most genuine affection existed within a context of power, calculation, and survival. The Sultan might also find companionship among his children, particularly when they were young and before succession anxieties poisoned family relationships. Playing with his sons and daughters, watching them learn and grow, could provide moments of simple human connection. But as princes matured, the shadow of succession fell across these relationships. The Sultan knew that his sons might one day compete for his throne, that they might be plotting against him or against each other, that his own passing would likely result in some of them being executed. How could a father fully love his sons, knowing they were potential threats to each other? and possibly to himself. How could he maintain emotional distance from children who deserved his affection, but who lived in a system that would turn them into rivals and victims? This tragic dimension of royal fatherhood weighed on sultans throughout their lives, another price of power that outsiders rarely understood. Friendship was perhaps the most difficult relationship for a sultan to maintain. True friendship requires a degree of equality, of mutual vulnerability, of trust that the other person values you for who you are rather than what you can do for them. These conditions were nearly impossible in the palace. Anyone close to the sultan wanted something: a promotion, a favour, protection, advancement for their family, a share of power or wealth. Even if someone genuinely liked the sultan as a person, the awareness of his power would always colour the relationship. Could the sultan ever really know if someone laughed at his jokes because they were funny, or because he was the sultan? Could he trust that advice given was for his good rather than for the advisor's benefit? Could he share confidences without worrying they would be used against him? These doubts poisoned potential friendships, leaving the sultan surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. Some sultans tried to find connection through intellectual and artistic pursuits. Surrounding themselves with poets, scholars, musicians and artists, they sought companionship in shared cultural interests. A sultan who loved poetry could discuss verses with court poets, commission new works, and engage in the kind of literary conversation that transcended immediate political concerns. A sultan interested in philosophy could debate with religious scholars and thinkers, exploring ideas and arguments for their own sake. These intellectual relationships could provide a degree of authentic connection, moments when the sultan engaged with others as a fellow human being rather than as an absolute ruler. But even here, the power dynamic remained. The poet needed the sultan's patronage. The scholar depended on the sultan's favour. Complete honesty was risky, genuine criticism potentially dangerous. So even these relationships, the closest the sultan could come to genuine friendship, remained constrained and complicated by the realities of power. The tragedy of the sultan's personal life was that he had everything except what might have mattered most: the freedom to be himself, to form relationships based on choice rather than obligation, to be loved for his personal qualities rather than his position, to trust without calculation, to be vulnerable without risk. He lived in a palace of thousands, yet was perhaps the loneliest person in the empire. This existential isolation, this fundamental human deprivation in the midst of material abundance, was as much a part of the sultan's experience as the silk robes and the jewelled throne. Let us now consider what happened as a sultan aged and his power began to wane. In a system built on the personal authority of one man, decline was inevitable and dangerous. Age brought physical weakness, reduced mental acuity, and made the sultan increasingly dependent on others. This dependence created opportunities for manipulation and power struggles that could destabilize the entire government. Some sultans recognized their declining abilities and tried to manage the transition gracefully. They might delegate more authority to trusted viziers while maintaining oversight of major decisions. They might begin preparing a favored son for succession, though this was risky as it could trigger premature power struggles. They might retreat into religious devotion, spending their final years in prayer and charitable works, seeking to atone for the inevitable sins and compromises of a lifetime of rule. These sultans understood that power was temporary, that they would eventually face death and divine judgment like any other person, and that it was wise to prepare for that ultimate transition, even while still holding earthly authority. Other sultans clung desperately to power as their faculties failed, refusing to acknowledge their decline or delegate effectively. They might become paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere, purging officials and advisors based on suspicion rather than evidence. They might withdraw from governance entirely, leaving a vacuum that competing factions would rush to fill. Or they might become erratic, issuing contradictory orders, making decisions one day and reversing them the next, creating chaos in the administration. During these periods of weak or unstable rule, the empire often suffered. Corruption would increase as officials realized the sultan was not effectively monitoring their actions. Foreign enemies might sense weakness and launch attacks. Internal rebellions might break out in provinces where local governors felt they could challenge central authority without facing consequences. The empire's strength had always rested partly on the sultan's personal authority and the fear his power inspired. When that authority weakened, the whole structure became shakier. The palace itself would become a battlefield during succession crises. As it became clear that the sultan's time was ending, factions would form around different potential successors. The Valid Sultan might back her favourite grandson. Powerful viziers might support candidates they believed they could control. Military commanders might have their own preferences based on which prince had promised them rewards or positions. Concubines would fight for their sons' chances. Eunuchs would pick sides. Everyone understood that the coming transition would determine not just who became sultan, but who would thrive and who would fall in the new reign. The stakes could not be higher, and people would take enormous risks, form unlikely alliances, and commit acts of treachery and violence to ensure they ended up on the winning side. When the sultan finally passed away, the transition could be smooth or chaotic depending on how well it had been prepared. If a clear successor existed and commanded broad support, the transfer of power might happen quickly with minimal disruption. The new sultan would immediately take steps to consolidate his authority, distributing rewards to supporters, confirming loyal officials in their positions, and dealing with potential rivals through execution, imprisonment, or exile to distant provinces. If the succession was disputed, however, civil conflict could erupt. Different princes might proclaim themselves sultans simultaneously. Military units might clash in the streets of Istanbul. Provincial governors might rebel or declare independence. These succession crises could last months or even years, devastating the empire's stability and security. The death of a sultan also meant personal catastrophe for many in the palace. Officials who had been close to the old sultan might find themselves out of favour with the new one. Concubines who had not borne sons, or whose sons had been eliminated in the succession struggle, would be expelled from the harem and sent to live in obscurity, their years of palace life ending in sudden exile. Servants associated with the losing faction might be dismissed or worse. The palace would be purged and reorganised to reflect the new sultan's preferences and the new power structure. Continuity existed in the empire's institutions and bureaucracy, but at the personal level, the sultan's passing marked an ending, a rupture, a moment when everything could change. So the aging sultan faced not just his personal mortality, but the knowledge that his passing would trigger upheaval that might harm the empire he had spent his life ruling. Some sultans in their final days must have wondered whether anything they had accomplished would endure, whether their sons would preserve or destroy their legacy, whether the empire would be stronger or weaker after they were gone. These were questions without answers, uncertainties that no amount of power could resolve. The absolute ruler faced his ultimate powerlessness, the inability to control what would happen after his life ended. Now, if you have made it this far with me through these marble halls and golden chambers, through the ceremonies and the secrets, the magnificence and the misery of the sultan's life, you might be feeling the weight of these stories. Your eyes might be heavy, your mind might be ready to rest. That is perfectly fine. You have walked a long way tonight, seen many things, and learned much about a life that was simultaneously extraordinary and tragic. The sultans had everything and nothing. They commanded millions but answered to no one, yet were themselves commanded by the inexorable requirements of their position. They lived in luxury but died in fear, surrounded by beauty but starved for genuine human connection. Before we reach the end of this journey, let me ask one final question that we will explore. What can we learn from the lives of the Ottoman sultans? What does their experience teach us about power, leadership, and the human condition? We will turn to these reflections as we prepare to close our exploration, but first let us consider a few more aspects of the Sultan's world, details that round out our understanding and bring this distant life into sharper focus. Because even as your consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, these final pieces of the story deserve to be told, completing the picture of what it truly meant to live as an Ottoman Sultan. The palace had its own economy, its own world of production and consumption, that reveals much about the material reality of the Sultan's life. The palace kitchens, as mentioned earlier, were massive operations employing hundreds of staff, but the scale and sophistication deserves further exploration. These kitchens were organised by specialty. One section for rice dishes, another for soups, another for roasted meats, another for pastries and sweets, another for drinks and sherbets, and so on. Each section had its own chief cook, its own staff, and its own carefully guarded recipes and techniques. The head cook was a significant official in the palace hierarchy, responsible not just for food preparation, but for managing supplies, maintaining quality standards, and preventing the poisoning that was an ever-present concern. The ingredients came from across the empire and beyond. Spices arrived from India and Southeast Asia through Ottoman trade networks. Sugar came from Egypt and Mediterranean islands. Rice was imported from Egypt and later from the Crimea. Honey came from Anatolia, known for its fine quality. Olive oil arrived from Greece and the Levant. Fresh fruits and vegetables were grown in palace gardens or purchased from nearby farms. Meat came from animals raised specifically for palace consumption, carefully inspected before slaughter. Fish was brought daily from the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, still alive to ensure freshness. The logistics of feeding thousands of people daily, maintaining high quality, preventing spoilage, and ensuring food safety required sophisticated organisation and management. It was a massive undertaking that operated every single day of the year without fail. The palace also had its own workshops producing goods for internal use and occasionally for sale or gifts. Calligraphers created beautiful documents, copying religious texts, producing official correspondence, and creating works of art combining text and decoration. Jewelers crafted ornaments for the Sultan and his family, set gems in intricate designs, and maintained the imperial treasury's collection of precious objects. Embroiderers worked on fabrics for palace use, creating elaborate patterns in gold and silver thread. Armourers maintained weapons and armour, not primarily for actual combat but for ceremonial purposes and as historical artefacts. Carpenters, masons, painters, and other craftsmen kept the palace buildings in good repair and constructed new additions as needed. This internal economy meant the palace was largely self-sufficient, depending on the outside world only for raw materials and certain specialised goods. It was a city within a city, producing much of what it needed and employing thousands of people in the process. The Sultan was not just a political leader, but also the head of this vast household economy, though he rarely involved himself in its daily management. That was delegated to specialised officials who reported to higher authorities who might, if issues were significant enough, bring matters to the Sultan's attention. But in normal times, the system ran itself, one of those institutional structures that made the empire function regardless of whether the current Sultan was capable or interested in administrative details. The treasury deserves special mention. The imperial treasury was separate from the state treasury, representing the Sultan's personal wealth rather than government funds. This treasury contained truly staggering riches. Rooms filled with gold coins, jewels of extraordinary size and quality, rare objects collected over centuries, religious relics, gifts from foreign rulers, and treasures seized from conquered territories. Some items had historical significance: swords that had belonged to early sultans, relics associated with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or his companions, or ancient objects from pre-Islamic civilizations. Others were simply valuable: massive emeralds, flawless diamonds, ropes of perfect pearls, gold vessels encrusted with gems. The treasury was both a practical reserve of wealth that could be drawn on in emergencies and a symbol of the dynasty's accumulated power and legitimacy. Showing selected pieces to foreign ambassadors was a way of demonstrating Ottoman wealth and sophistication. Distributing items as rewards to loyal officials helped maintain their allegiance. Using treasury funds for public projects like mosque construction demonstrated the Sultan's piety and generosity. But the treasury also represented continuity. Each Sultan inherited it and was expected to add to it, leaving it larger and richer for his successor. A Sultan who depleted the treasury through waste or poor judgment would be condemned by history. One who enriched it through successful military campaigns, wise financial management, or receipt of valuable gifts would be praised. The treasury was tangible proof of the dynasty's success across generations, a material manifestation of imperial glory that existed independently of any individual sultan's virtue or failure. Security in the palace was another complex system worthy of examination. Multiple overlapping layers of guards and surveillance ensured the sultan's safety, while also monitoring everyone else within the palace. At the outermost layer were the palace guards, military units responsible for the gates and walls. These were regular soldiers from the Ottoman army, rotated through palace duty as part of their service. They controlled who entered and left the palace grounds, checked credentials, and watched for external threats. Inside the palace, different groups provided security for different areas. White eunuchs guarded the administrative and public sections where the Sultan conducted government business. Black eunuchs controlled access to the harem and the Sultan's private quarters. Janissaries provided additional military presence and served as a kind of internal police force. This division of responsibility meant no single group had complete control, reducing the risk of a successful coup. Each group watched the others as well as outsiders, creating a system of mutual surveillance that made conspiracy difficult though not impossible. The Sultan's personal bodyguards, selected for absolute loyalty and martial skill, stayed close to him whenever he moved through the palace or ventured outside. These men were often drawn from enslaved populations, typically from the Caucasus or the Balkans, who had been raised from childhood in palace service. Having no family connections or external loyalties, they were considered more trustworthy than freeborn subjects who might have divided allegiances. They were trained in various weapons, taught to be alert to any threat, and conditioned to sacrifice their own lives without hesitation to protect the Sultan. Their presence was both reassurance and reminder. The Sultan was constantly at risk and could never afford to be unguarded or unaware of danger. Despite all these precautions, palace security sometimes failed. Several sultans were assassinated or deposed through internal coups. Usually these involved conspiracies among high officials and military commanders rather than simple assassination attempts. The plotters would need to neutralize the various guard forces, secure control of key palace locations, and either kill the Sultan or force his abdication before loyalist forces could respond. Successful coups required careful planning, broad support, and often the backing of the janissaries, whose military power made them kingmakers when they chose to involve themselves in politics. The constant possibility of such plots meant every sultan had to maintain the loyalty of key power centres, particularly the military, through a combination of rewards, respect, and fear of consequences for betrayal. This need to maintain military loyalty brings us to one final aspect of the sultan's life: his relationship with the janissaries. This elite military corps had originally been created in the 14th century after Christ through a unique system called devshirme. Christian boys from conquered territories, typically from the Balkans, would be taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained for either military or administrative service. The most capable would be educated for government positions. The others would become janissaries. This system created a class of servants who owed everything to the Sultan and the Ottoman state, having been removed from their original communities and given a completely new identity and purpose. For centuries, the janissaries were extraordinarily effective soldiers, feared across Europe and the Middle East for their discipline, skill and loyalty. They formed the core of Ottoman military power, the shock troops who broke enemy formations and held the most crucial positions in battle. But over time, the janissary corps changed. They began to marry and have families. They involved themselves in commerce and crafts. They became more like a hereditary military caste than an elite slave corps, and most significantly, they developed political power within Istanbul and the empire, using their military strength to pressure sultans and influence policy. By the 17th and 18th centuries after Christ, the janissaries had become as much a problem as an asset. They resisted military reforms, clung to outdated tactics and weapons, and often performed poorly in battle against modernizing European armies, but they were too powerful to simply disband. They could riot in the capital, intimidate officials, and threaten or depose sultans who challenged them too directly. Many sultans had to walk a delicate line, trying to maintain janissary support while also attempting gradual reforms to improve military effectiveness. Some sultans gave up and simply appeased the janissaries, accepting military decline rather than risking confrontation. Others tried to reform and faced rebellions that cost them their throne or their life. This relationship encapsulates a broader truth about the sultan's position. For all his theoretical absolute power, he was constrained by practical realities. He needed the janissaries, the bureaucracy, the religious establishment, the provincial governors, and other power centres to cooperate for the empire to function. If he pushed too hard against their interests, they could resist, sabotage his policies, or overthrow him outright. The sultan's power was real, but not unlimited. It had to be exercised carefully, with attention to the balance of forces and the limits of what the system would bear. A wise sultan understood these constraints and worked within them. An unwise sultan might believe his own propaganda about absolute authority and discover too late that power unsupported by key constituencies was merely an illusion. Now, as we near the end of our journey through the sultan's world, let us reflect on what these lives teach us. The Ottoman sultans lived in circumstances utterly different from our own, separated by centuries and cultural chasms, yet their experiences illuminate timeless truths about human nature, power, and the costs of leadership. They show us that power and freedom are not the same thing, that one can command millions yet be imprisoned by one's position. They demonstrate that security measures, no matter how elaborate, cannot eliminate risk, that leadership always involves vulnerability no matter how many guards surround you. They reveal that genuine human connection requires a degree of equality and mutual choice that hierarchy makes nearly impossible, that loneliness can exist in the midst of crowds. The sultan's lives also teach us about the corrupting potential of absolute power. When no one can say no to you, when every whim can be fulfilled, when dissent is punished and criticism silenced, it becomes nearly impossible to develop accurate self-knowledge or realistic assessment of one's abilities. The Sultan lived in an echo chamber where flattery was rewarded and honesty was dangerous. This meant he often received distorted information, surrounded by people telling him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Only the strongest characters could resist this corrosive effect, and even they could never be entirely sure whether their judgments were sound or simply unchallenged because no one dared contradict them. Yet we must also acknowledge what the sultans achieved. Despite the constraints and corruptions of their position, many sultans governed reasonably well. They maintained an empire that, at its peak, was among the most powerful, sophisticated, and culturally rich in the world. They patronized arts and architecture that still inspire awe. They created systems of law and administration that, while far from perfect by modern standards, provided order and stability for millions. They balanced competing religious, ethnic, and regional interests within a vast multicultural empire. These were not easy tasks, and the sultans who accomplished them deserve recognition for their achievements, even as we acknowledge the problematic nature of absolute monarchy and the human costs of the system. The story of the Ottoman sultans is ultimately a human story. Behind the magnificent robes and the jeweled turbans were individual people facing universal questions. How should I live? What should I value? How do I deal with fear, loneliness, and mortality? What kind of legacy will I leave? These are questions we all face, regardless of our station. The sultans answered them in ways shaped by their extraordinary circumstances, but the underlying challenges were the same challenges that confront any human being trying to navigate existence and find meaning. As we conclude our exploration tonight, imagine for a moment the quiet of the palace after sunset. The gates are closed, the courtyard's empty. The fountains still flow, their gentle splashing echoing off marble walls. The cypress trees sway in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the private quarters, a sultan sits alone, perhaps looking out over the city, over the empire he rules, over the millions of lives he commands but can never truly know. He's the most powerful man in the world, and he is utterly, profoundly alone. What are his thoughts in this moment? Does he feel satisfaction at his achievements? Or does he wonder what it would be like to live differently? Does he think about the brothers he ordered executed, the sons who will compete for his throne, the mother who is probably the only person who loves him without calculation? Does he contemplate the divine judgment that awaits him, the accounting he will one day give for how he used the power entrusted to him? We cannot know his inner thoughts, cannot truly understand what it felt like to be him, but we can imagine, and in imagining we connect across the centuries to another human life, another person struggling with the eternal questions in circumstances stranger than most of us will ever experience. This is what history offers us, not just facts and dates, not just the rise and fall of empires, but connection to human beings who lived before us, whose choices shaped the world we inherited, whose experiences expand our understanding of what human life can be. Thank you for accompanying me tonight. Dear listener, I hope this narrative has given you a different perspective. I will be with you in the next video. For now, good night.